So hello everyone and welcome back. So today we are going to look into we are talking about the first module, which is a foundation of ecological economics. And in this lecture, in lecture 3, we will move from neoclassical economics to environmental economics. But before we do that, let's quickly do a recap of what we have learned so far. So if you recall that when we spoke about classical economics, one of the most interesting thing about classical economics was, be it Ricardo, Malthus, and Mill, all of them actually spoke about, or they showed their concern about limits to growth. Now, although they spoke about free markets, production, and growth was their main focus, but they did also recognize that economy cannot grow forever, and there will be certain challenges. And these challenges are mainly due to population growth versus the amount of resources we have to feed that population. So the whole concern was that that population is going to grow at such a rate that the land, the resources, which is required for us to provide food to the population will fall short. And as a result, our economy will stop growing. Borrowing from Malthus, what Ricardo came up with, and he also believed that there would be a limit to growth, but he focused specifically on land scarcity. And his argument was that, if there is scarcity of land, there could be an increase in the rent for land. And when there is increase in rent for land, it is going to reduce the profit that capitalists make. And if there is reduction in the profit, then there will be less capital available to reinvest. And as a result, we would see that the economy would reach a stage where it will not grow at all. That's what he explained as something called steady state. Now, one of the interesting things between Ricardo and Mill was that Mill also actually spoke about steady state, but Mill's way of looking at steady state was more desirable. Whereas for Ricardo, no economy should, or economy should, find out ways not to reach a situation of steady state. Whereas for Mill, every economy should actually aim to achieve a steady state economy, because that is the time when we will have enough resources, because we have been growing for so many decades now, and now we need to look at a distribution aspect of what we have accumulated so far. So how can we distribute our resources in a way that it leads to equity, improves quality of life, and also a matter of sustainability. But what is interesting in case of classical economics, as you see, is that there was a recognition, whether in a positive way or in a negative way, that economy will not grow forever. And so either you keep that in mind and work towards it so that your economy can continue growing, but there are, you try to achieve something where you are at the stage of steady state, as Mill explained. But there was this whole concept of limits to growth. But when we moved from classical economics to the neoclassical economics, and as you remember, one of the reasons why classical economics actually, failed to explain a lot of questions that we raised was because it did not look at the role of technology that it is going to play. And particularly at the time when we did see industrial revolution coming in, a lot of technology actually coming in. So that's why the neoclassical economics fell short. And then we moved to a new school of economics, and that is the neoclassical economics. Now, when you look at neoclassical economics, and if you remember, we spoke about marginal utility, profit maximization, and that they had strong faith in markets and particularly technology. And they also felt that economy is self-regulating. So they viewed the economy as something it can regulate on its own, and it can, expand without any limit. And so technology was considered to be one of the main way of, not reaching limits to growth, so we can grow in a limitless manner. So that's the basic major difference, because then we stop talking about limits to growth entirely. But there is also one more fundamental issue to remember when we talk about neoclassical economics and classical economics. So for classical economics, the focus was a lot on the long run problem of economic growth. Now, what does that mean? If you really look at what the classical economists like, Malthus, Ricardo, and Mill was talking about, that was something yet to come. That means not today. They were not bothered about what is happening today or tomorrow, but they were more bothered about what is going to happen in the future. So their concern was that how to increase wealth of nation with limited land. So land for them was limited, and but there will be unlimited supply of labor, meaning there will be a lot of growth of population whom you will have to ensure that they survive, they have work jobs to do, but you have limited land. So their view was mostly from a long-term perspective. But for neoclassical economics, it was a completely different story. For them, what we need to focus is the short run problem. What are we confronted with today and maybe tomorrow, but not what is going to happen, 60 years down the line or 50 years down the line. That's not something we should be worried about, because according to one of the economists, J.M. Keynes, who basically also mentioned that in the long run, we are all dead. So why should we think about something when we are not even there? So let's talk about today. And so neoclassical economists were mostly concerned with short-run problem of allocation of given resources with maximum benefit. Although they did know that there will be an issue with the population growth, but for them, this growth, population growth, will not create any problem in the short run. Because in the short run, it would take time for the population to grow, right? So therefore, in the short run, we have enough labor supply, whatever is needed, given the amount of land that we have. So we should not really worry so much about what would happen in the future. And the basic question that they asked is how to utilize the given resources which have alternative uses. So land can have alternative uses. It can be used for agriculture, it can be used for industry, it can be used for housing. So it has alternative uses, but we need to find out where are we going to get the maximum result, where we need to actually put our resources, our limited resources, in a way which will give us maximum outcome. So that was something major focus of neoclassical economics. So points to remember that we actually moved from a macro or a nation perspective to actually a firm perspective. We came down to individual firms, individual households, so more at the micro scale. And so, like I have mentioned in the earlier slide, neoclassical view was entirely a view where there is no limit to growth, particularly because technology will take care of a lot of, issues that we may be confronted while growing. And to some extent, I would say that is true as well. Like I mentioned in the earlier class, Malthus' theory that when population grows, we will not grow anymore is no longer in a way valid too, because we know that there has been a lot of increase in population since Malthus' time, but there has been, a country like India is a food secure, country. So that other thing that to remember, if you remember the diagram that I showed in the first class, is that environment is only a subcomponent of a larger economy. So economy is the whole, and environment is a component, is something which absolutely came back during the time of neoclassical economics. And they looked at the role of environment, something as which is a source of economic growth and also a sink of all the unwanted byproduct that is generated during the economic process. There was a belief that that is man-made capital, can replace natural capital entirely. And the role of market is very important, because it's only through market we can lead to efficient allocation of scarce resources. So this was a very important difference between neoclassical and classical economics. Now, was there no criticism? Well, even today, these criticisms are there. But one thing to remember here is that while we are going to critique neoclassical economics, it doesn't mean that today we are not still ruled by neoclassical economics. Most of our economic policies continue to be dominated by neoclassical economic thought, because most of us are also taught neoclassical economics, right? So one of the things that is a major critique of neoclassical economics is that it ignores ecological limits. And I don't think I need to explain that. And that is why they talk about no limit to growth. It also ignores the environmental damage. They consider them to be absolutely outside the production process. And so there is no kind of cost that needs to be associated in the production process or brought into the production process to capture these environmental degradation or pollution. So this is considered to be outside the economic models. There is an absence of nature entirely in its model. Like I gave you the example of circular flow, where it talks about firm and household and natural resource as one of the core input going to the firm is not even depicted in that diagram. So while there is an understanding that environment does play as a source of resource, which is also important, say, for example, forest, water, all of these are key component of any economy. But it was not really implicitly explained to play a very important role in our economic production. And so it remains outside the model. The question of optimal scale, something we discussed, is that while at the firm level, it was very clear that no firm will go to an extent where they will see that they are making losses, and losses in the sense where they will see that the cost of producing their last unit, when they take that last unit to the market, they receive lesser revenue. That means that they should stop because their marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue. So what they did was that they say that we should stop where our marginal cost, meaning producing the last unit, and the amount of money that we are fetching by selling that in the market is absolutely equal. So MC is equal to MR. But that was at the firm level, but there was no discussion or no such stop rule at the macroeconomy level, at the level of the country as a whole. So there can be thousands and thousands of firms which may join the economy, open up their farms, but there can be an unchecked expansion because there is no stop rule that how many firms can actually go on operating because they are at MC is equal to MR, which is where, so at the firm level, they are absolutely doing well, but at the macroeconomy level, we do not know where one should stop. There is a short-term orientation, which is what I just mentioned. And, this short-term orientation is something today we see that in the long run. So something which happened in the 18th century, 19th century, today we see the implications of these, economic processes, for example, as climate change. But that time, or even, because the focus was only short run, and it is true that Keynes is no longer alive, but the fact remains that all of that, what neoclassical economics focused on, which was very essential at that time, but without keeping in mind the long-term implication. So today we see the implication of such neglect of long-term sustainability. And the last but not the least is ignoring the opportunity cost of growth. And that when an economy expands, we know that there is a loss of a lot of forest, water resources, wetlands, many other biodiversity. That was never considered to be a cost, as if there is no opportunity cost of growing. There is no trade-offs of growing. One can continue growing because we are not losing anything when we are, expanding our economy. So that is the kind of, assumption that neoclassical economics functioned with. Now, these critics are not something that has come up now. These critics actually, these concerns related to particularly environment came up something at this time of 1950s itself. And some of the prominent issues which came forward in 1950s, which we also call it as a rise of environmentalism, is a concern about that the environment is really degrading the atmosphere. And in mid-1950s, a group of scientists found that the CO2 emission, that the Earth's carbon dioxide level actually has started to change abruptly. For centuries, we saw that there was a steady kind of pattern, but all of a sudden in 1958, when first observation happened of the Earth's carbon dioxide, they found that it has started to increase in a very, very strange manner. So that was the first signal that something is going wrong, something that we are doing in the long run, we will see some kind of implication. And so we do see today as the CO2 emissions are far beyond than what we should ideally have to have a cooler Earth. Another important, thing that happened in 1962 is Rachel Carson, who wrote against something that is the DDT, use of DDT in agriculture, because there were several evidences that there was so much of use of chemicals which actually had a negative impact on human population. And she wrote something called Silent Spring, which was published by New Yorker magazine, which is actually a very mainstream magazine and which was read by a lot of people across the world, and due to which it sparked a lot of controversy and discussion related to that, how economic growth is having an impact on not just natural environment, but also on human being. So this was also one very important turning point. And as you know, that DDT was banned entirely, although she had to fight and many others had to fight a long battle. The first Earth Day was celebrated on April 2022, probably first of its kind, where we actually spoke about the Earth. And we spoke about that, and a lot of grassroots activists also came in, and a lot of groundbreaking environmental legislations were brought up. And to let you know, even India's Water Act was formulated in 1975 because of all of these environmentalism that we saw in the Western world in particular. Another very important breakthrough, or I would say a very strong message about limits to growth, and that also with data, because so far what you saw, there was no strong evidence, there was no strong data to prove what actually people were writing or talking, even at the scientist or academic level. But in 1972, a team from MIT, it's a research team, and this report is actually commissioned by an international organization called Club in Rome. They commissioned this report, which is also known as Meadows and Meadow, because Dennis Meadow and Donella Meadow developed this report. And what they did was they used a computer model which is called World 3, and they studied the interaction with whatever limited data was available on the relationship or interaction between population growth, industrial production, the way we were using resources, and pollution that these industrial production was generating. And their report clearly came up with a few points. The first point was that the planet Earth is finite, and that we cannot really have infinite growth on a finite planet. And so the word limits to growth, although during classical economics was, we are talking about it, but it was not explicitly mentioned as limits to growth. But the word limits to the growth actually became very prominent after this report was published by Club of Rome. They also mentioned that physical growth has to stop, because if you do not stop, it could lead to catastrophic impact. There will be a global overshoot, meaning you might use up a lot of resources and our planet might move to a situation where it goes beyond the carrying capacity of the planet. And then again, it will have a lot of impact on the natural ecosystem and also on the human system. It is possible, but they also was very positive by saying that what Mill mentioned, that, steady state is desirable, something that they also mentioned, that we can actually stop the growth. And if you stop the growth, it's not something that it's going to create a lot of ruckus. It is actually can be very peaceful, it can be equitable, and it will be also sustainable. But for that, what we need is a lot of proactive policies. And these policies should be social as well as technical policies, so that in the sense that we are able to change our behavior, our technologies are greener, and also that overall, while we still have our, per capita income high, our living standard high, but at the same time, we don't really have to grow forever. And they also ended by saying, sooner we do this, sooner we realize that we cannot grow forever, better it is for the mankind. Okay, but what was our reaction? Did we really reacted to this in 1972? If you really talk about the scientific community, well, some of the group of scientific community did support it, because that's why a lot of research happen about systems thinking, meaning you can't just think about one aspect. Whenever you are doing any kind of intervention, there will be an impact on other system as well. So bring these human system, ecosystems, all of these together. Even within ecosystems and within human system, you have to bring things together. There were a lot of very new innovative approaches also came up, and there is a lot of use of computers. When I'm saying computers, I mean to say it's a lot of use of data, so that large set data can be used and analyzed to see the impact. Economics community were not so happy with these studies. If you really talk about, when I say scientific community, I decided to bring the economist a bit out, given that how did they react, right? For them, this data is too pessimistic. I mean, you can't really depend on this little amount of data and say that all that is happening is bad. We need much more research and data to actually draw any conclusion. But they continue to believe that even if there are depletion, technology can always take care of such depletion. There was misunderstanding of predictive nature of the study. I mean, they say that these are all very predicting, that it will happen. Well, that is why we are saying that it will happen if we don't have the real kind of technology. But we are very, strong in our understanding that technologies will further develop with more interventions, more innovations, and all of these that we are talking about can be taken care of. And then, of course, market is there to bring us rescue whenever there is a need. But this was also a time when you didn't really see a lot of social and policy community coming or engaging with this kind of discussion. Like it was sometimes in 1970s and 80s, and at the time you wouldn't really see that the kind of social media that you see today wasn't there. So it didn't. This kind of conversation mostly remain confined within the academic community and did not percolate down so much to the society or even to the policymakers. Um, but what happened during this time when all of these environmentalism was going on, it led to the rise of some amount of environmental awareness. And although this environmental awareness, as I mentioned, was more confined to the scientific community, but it also basically, I mean, there were a group of economists who came out of neoclassical economics, and they thought that we need to research more on the environment. And this is why we say that from 1960s onwards, we do see that environmental economics began to grow as a discipline, although it has not taken a proper shape. But across the world, wherever people who were concerned and who were economists, who did see that there are flaws in the neoclassical models, did thought of coming together and working around, particularly looking at the industrial pollution. That was also a time when urbanization was taking a lot of traction. There were also several visible environmental degradation. And particularly, as I mentioned, these events, one of the most important event again was the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, which is something which also gave a lot of global recognition. Probably first of its kind, where so many people came together. So environment all of a sudden became a policy and economic issues because of all of these discussions that was going on. And finally, in 1970s and 80s, we saw a formalization of environmental economics as a discipline. So there was a lot of hope that this new discipline that has come up which, because it started to take some structure and shape as well, will help us in understanding costs and benefit associated with a lot of economic activities that we are doing, and that it will also help us in valuing the costs of degrading these environmental goods. Like I mentioned, that neoclassical economics was not able to capture the opportunity cost of growing. So this was an expectation that environmental economics will be able to do so, and also development of several pollution control policies that would come up. And some of the policy tools that came up also at that time was pollution taxes, regulation, emission control mechanism. So the entire focus was about how do you correct all of those which market is yet not able to take care of or was not able to capture. That pollution that you are seeing, it is not sold in the market, but how do we still capture that which remains outside the market? This is something which we will take up more in detail in the next class. But I would like to end here today's lecture with this word, that this was a new hope for a lot of people, that many things which neoclassical economics was doing was bringing a lot of environmental impact. A growth of environmental economics who is concerned about environment and is aware about this environmental degradation will be able to come up with some solution to this problem. Okay, thank you very much.